Okay, so welcome back to class. We've gone quite a bit of journey already. We've already gone through the Romanticism. We talked a little bit in last class about nationalism in Europe and how that fueled pretty much the entire century. And we talked mostly about German nationalism with Richard Wagner and Johannes Brahms and among other people. And I mentioned very briefly that the Romantic movement in other parts of the Europe is very much influenced by that of the German nationalism. I mean, in parts of Europe, particularly where the national identity was not so clear, this was a great inspiration for them to really try to assert their identity. And for example, in what is now Czech Republic, there were composers such as Bedřich Smetana or Antonín Dvořák, who really explored their folk music. And it is not really that much different for the Russians, and that is our main topic of the day, Russian Romanticism. How appropriate that you are here now. And of course, when I say Russia, we're talking about the realm currently recognized as the former territories of the Russian Empire. So we're not just focusing on Russia, but also modern day Estonia, Ukraine, and such and such and such, and certain part of Central Asia as well. Russia, in many ways, kept itself busy with problems within for very much. I'm not going to go very much in detail as to what happened before 1820s, but with Catherine the Great, there is some sort of consolidation of power and system in place, and that allowed for foreign cultural exchanges to happen. And one of the more significant musical event that happened was when Robert Schumann, that we mentioned before, visited Russia in 1850s. And this was a big influence over the Russian musicians who hadn't really been exposed very much to that of the contemporary music scene at the time. Of course, that doesn't mean that Russia didn't have music before that. For example, as early as the 18 teens, the Russian imperial court employed Italian singers to come and sing Rossini operas. So, I mean, music was certainly being played, but Russia was always sort of like not quite involved. And it was really the German nationalist movement that inspired Russians to take a step forward in coming up with their own identity as well in music. So I want to talk a little bit about what that entails, because just looking in the room, and I don't know who's going to be watching later, there's only probably one person who's aware of what I'm talking about, and it's like over there. And I think I want to mention a few things and play a lot of excerpts today to try to expose you into a very generalized sort of a Spark Notes version of what Russian culture is like. Oh, hello. I wrote on the right corner where it says number 1, Russian nationalism. The Russian nationalism means looking for your own voice as a Russian musical identity. And obviously, one of the first things that comes to mind is folk music, music of the people. I wrote there, day-to-day snapshot of peasantry. This was something that is often repeated not only in music, but in literature. If you read novels by Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, you see these things happening. You see paintings of Russian romantics, painting things like, boatmen dragging the boat up, or in the wheat field, so on and so on. And so I have here kind of a cool little thing. This title sort of translates to something to the effect of "There over the dark forest." And let's listen to it. So there you had a little snippet of the Russian folk music. I'd like to ask the room, any thoughts? Yes.
I felt like there would be like certain women singing in the like beginning, and then the men would be changing their melody, and they would have the melody. And then when the men were singing, the women would be changing the melody, but then eventually it would all resolve to the same note.
Right. And you see that there's some sort of a trophic structure to it, where you have the singer, main singer, then you'd have the entire chorus. Main singer, entire chorus. And within the chorus, they're imitating in a way. Yeah? They're chasing after each other's melody, so to speak, like you were mentioning earlier. Good. How about the general style of music? Does this sound Western to you? Yes.
Sounds a little religious, like Jewish.
Aha,
thinking, you know?
Jewish. How about you, Eric?
I feel like you could say it might sound similar to something you might hear maybe in like Central Asia or.
Absolutely. And I think this is very important for us to discuss, is that the influence of the Central Asians to the Russians all the way to the Western Hemisphere, I think, is pretty significant. You know, I'm not even sure if Russians are consciously aware of it, but I mean, the fact that Mongols invaded pretty much the entire Russian land, I think the influence is, you know, just as I wasn't intending to play this, but since this channel does have, I'm going to play for you an Euntaek throat singing, which is that of the Mongolian and Euntaek peoples. This is Mongolian music. Definitely hear influence of that. This was a great throat singer, Baturik Vanchik, over in Mongolia. Great singer. In this video on YouTube, which I can't show you if you don't have a projector, he's on top of a mountain in the middle of a blue sky and just playing this throat singing. It's a really cool video. I wish you can see it. But at any rate, so there's that folk element to it. And then I wrote as a second element is the liturgical music, music of the church, music of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I wrote there a chorus. I should also mention chants and bells. The notion of bells in Russian Orthodox Church, I think, is really great. I don't know what, may I bother you a little bit? I don't know what your background is. Are you of religiously which background? None.
No.
Okay, none. Okay. I'm not Russian Orthodox, but my understanding is that certain bells signify certain meanings, and I have here an example which is particular for the Easter Sunday, and that usually refers to the victory of life, right, of the resurrection, which is so profound in Christianity. And so I'm going to show you, I'm going to play some excerpts of the Russian Orthodox chant and bells and so on. So here's a chant. Like to play an excerpt from Vespers by Sergei Rachmaninoff, which is not technically speaking traditional, but it's written in the style. So I think it'll be a good example for you here. excerpts that I just showed you sort of show you, in a nutshell, the things that you could expect in a liturgy in Russian Orthodox Church. Let's start with the bells, and I'm looking at the front row because I'm actually really interested in what our Asians have to say. Can you tell me, if you will, something unique about the way bells are ringing here with regards to, say, in comparison with that of, Catholic bells in Italy, for example, or German bells in, let's say, in Cologne? Does this sound, again, European? For me, this sounds more Asiatic. I mean, I remember as a Korean kid, like watching a bunch of small bells being ringing in a similar way.
Buddhist.
Sounds Buddhist.
Yeah.
There's definitely Asiatic influence there, right? And with regards to the chants and the Rachmaninoff piece, did you notice that there is the similarity with the folk music that we had heard earlier? Yeah. So before we go to the third element, I want to play for you some excerpts from a piece called Pictures at an Exhibition by Modest Mussorgsky, who is on the 4 of the 5, where it says the Mighty Five. These were 5 composers that were so-called the Russian nationalists, and they really aimed to write music that was truly Russian in spirit. All of them were amateur musicians, actually. They were either military officers, chemists, they had other jobs, lawyers. That's how little enforcement the so-called first generation of Russian romantics had with regards to education. And a lot of them wrote because they had sheer talent. And a lot of them lacked musical education, the kind of education that you'd have received from Mozart, Beethoven, so on and so forth. But their talent was great. Their talent was great in capturing the sound of the people and emulate it. So you have here a very well-celebrated piece called Pictures in an Exhibition by Mussorgsky. And here's the famous first piece called Promenade. I'd like you to see if you can pick out some of the things that you just heard in those musical excerpts I played for you earlier. What some of the things could you catch out of that? Yes.
I think immediately in the beginning of the piece, you can hear the connection with the exact excerpt that you showed us with the folk music, where it starts off as one leading voice before there's an accompaniment that follows.
Exactly, it's a whole choir that follows. That's right. The rhythmic pattern, ya da dum, dee da dee da da dum. This is very common. That was all throughout the Russian excerpts of the folk music as well as the chant music. I'm going to skip to the last movement. I'm going to skip to an excerpt. This is a quite difficult piece, so we'll see what happens. So what elements could you catch out of that?
Bell.
Bells.
Yeah, bells.
Right, bells. So, as you can see, the music is permeated with the elements that people would recognize as their day-to-day scenery, right? And it's not just wood mussorgsky. I mean, there are other elements. The beginning of Sergei Rachmaninov's Piano Concerto Number 2 begins famously like this. Again, bells. Continues on that way with the orchestra coming in with the melody. The third element I'd like to mention, I wrote here as exoticism / imperialism, particularly to the Middle East. Part of the Middle East, especially Central Asia, as well as parts of what is now Azerbaijan and so on and so forth, were part of Russian Empire at the time. And so this was sort of like the outskirts of the empire that the Russians would often dream about, often fantasize about. And among the Mighty Five composers, it was a great effort to incorporate Arabic music into their music as well. It's sort of an inclusion of their empire. It sort of served a nice propaganda for the Russian Empire to say we're full of all these various types of people. So I found this really neat excerpt. It's not really from the former Russian Empire territory, but I think it gives us a good idea as to what Middle Eastern music should sound. Okay, and now I'm going to play for you a well-known orchestra piece by Rimsky-Korsakov called Sherazade. Obviously sort of an introduction. play this all day, but we have a limited time. So among those two excerpts of some authentic Middle Eastern music in comparison with the rendition by Rimsky-Korsakov, what are the similarities you could find? Just by hearing. Minor key. And I think you're actually referring to what we call the exotic scale, where the notes are bent, right? In fact, it was interesting. Rimsky-Korsakov, who was one of the only one of the five that decided, well, we really should get educated in music before we try to write music, ended up eventually writing a treatise on composition after having been thoroughly educated in the German music theory. And in it, suggests a new idea, which is not found in Western Europe in textbooks, notion called melodic major and harmonic major. Now, for those of you who've learned about scales, you heard of harmonic minor and melodic minor, but you've probably never heard of harmonic major and melodic major. Have you? No. It's not talked about. In fact, I got into an interesting conversation with a faculty at Lindenblatt School of Music named Grigory Smirnov, who's Russian, and he said that he was taught this, and that it was surprising and disappointing that it was not taught in the United States, the notion of harmonic major and melodic major. And what it is essentially a major scale, except that the sixth note is bent downward, therefore giving melodic minor is major scale with sixth and seventh note lower. And these are some of the scales you find in Arabic music. And so all Rimsky-Korsakov was doing was incorporate the Arabic scale into Western Hemisphere. And this is found all over the place by Russian composers, particularly I would say with Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff. Let's see, for example. So these are the three main elements. Of course, there are many, many more things I could go into, but these are the three main elements that I would point out that is distinguishable about Russian music. Underneath the my five is our well-known composer Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky was born in 1840 and died in 1893. He's well known for us for his ballet music, The Nutcracker, which you hear once a year. Absolutely, if not at the theater, at least in commercials. He also wrote The Swan Lake and many other ballet works. But he was also well versed in not only theatrical music such as ballet and opera, but also in symphonies. His last symphony, known as the Symphonie Pathétique, is a very powerful work. I highly recommend listening to it. But of course, there's also fifth and fourth symphonies, which are also performed all the time. His concertos, piano concerto, is well loved, as well as his violin concerto. And he also wrote many short chamber works for various instruments, as well as solo works. And the reason why Tchaikovsky is not included in the Mighty Five is because he refused to be part of it. For a while, Tchaikovsky, who was both a musician and a lawyer, started taking lessons with a composer named Balakirev, who was sort of the boss of the five. And Balakirev was asking him to incorporate all of this folk element into his music. But Tchaikovsky was frustrated at the fact that the Mighty Five were just a bunch of uneducated amateurs trying to write music. And that he could not possibly ignore the great works of the German composers, particularly of Robert Schumann, which he absolutely loved. So eventually he drifted away from the nationalism and created his own version of it. This is not to say that he completely abandoned folk element, You can hear a lot of folk element in Tchaikovsky's music, but he approached it in sort of a Western European sentiment. For example, for piano, he wrote a set called The Seasons, of which there are 12 pieces, one for each month. And we play the 7th one, July, the Reaper's Song. Version of folk music, but other elements as well. January, which immediately starts off as something that Schumann would write. Much more intricate. And Tchaikovsky, of course, inspired many next generation composers to really think hard on the importance of, well, first learning how to write music properly. So even though the intentions of the My Five were great, they all sort of squandered away by the end. And it's really the Tchaikovsky, along with Rimsky-Korsakov, that educated the next generation of composers. And generalizing fashion, the Russian Romanticism splits into two factions, one of Moscow and the other of St. Petersburg. And Tchaikovsky sort of becomes the head of the Moscow faction, and Rimsky-Korsakov of the St. Petersburg faction. Long story short, it's the Rimsky-Korsakov group that eventually brings the Russian music to the forefront of 20th century music, with the birth of composers such as Sergei Prokofiev and Igor Stravinsky, and both of whom studied with Rimsky-Korsakov. And Tchaikovsky faction branches off to these two composers that I wrote here, who I personally categorize as the post-romantics. This is because it's hard to place them in groups in terms of a style. Rachmaninoff, a master of harmony and counterpoint, was placed in a really awkward timeline. He was born in 1873 and lived and died in the United States for half of his life. He died in Los Angeles. And the first half of the 1900s, to say the least, was a very turbulent time with two world wars and revolution and revolutions. and the Great Depression, so on and so forth. It was a very turbulent time, and with the turbulent time came a great deal of changes, which we'll talk about in the next class. But for Rachmaninoff, it was very difficult to let go of the core of expression, which for him was that of the Russian folk. I'll give you a little anecdote. Rachmaninoff was pianist, conductor, and composer. And composing was his true passion. And conducting was something which he could tolerate. And piano playing he really did not like doing. And in his Russian life, before the revolution, he slowly but surely drifts away into composing and conducting. But it was the 1917 revolution that displaced him from his homeland. You see, he was a member of the aristocracy. So his family was allowed one suitcase per person and leave the country within a certain period of time. And so they really literally ran away, and they burned his house down and all of that wonderful stuff. And he wandered around, eventually found himself in the United States with no money whatsoever in his 40s. And what he had to do was to play concerts so that he could survive. And so this was when he couldn't write as much music. So actually it's surprising that in his 69-year-old life, he was only able to complete 45 opuses total. But at any rate, the story that I'm about to tell you is before the revolution. This is in the early 1900s, when the Americans were trying to convince him to tour the United States for the first time. And Rachmaninoff was completely hesitant. He didn't want to do it. He didn't want to travel. He didn't want to play piano concerts. He didn't want to do it. But what convinced him to eventually take the gig, was the fact that the American manager would buy him farming equipments that were just developed by Ford, and which was a new thing. And for Rachmaninoff, his favorite hobby was farming. His family had a property called Ivanovka, where he farmed along with his serfs and whatnot. And that was his comfort. That was a place where he found connection with people. And that's what got him to go, okay, I'm gonna go buy some tractors with these concerts. So as I was mentioning before, the world was changing and his style was changing, but he could not lose the connection of that Russian spirit. And I think it's also possible that his composition dried out as he was living in the United States, because he was no longer surrounded by his people, no longer surrounded by his culture. And the culture that he knew, the Imperial Russia, was long gone. You know, Russia was suffering from a great deal of civil war, as well as just unrest in general. And this was very heartbreaking. And it wasn't just Rachmaninoff, by the way. Many Russian immigrant musicians felt this way. I believe it was Stravinsky that once said that all Russian musicians are suffering inside because they see that their homeland is becoming, I'm paraphrasing here, becoming farther and farther away from them. So Rachmaninoff did modernize harmonically. He did try the modern style, but he could not let go of the romantic spirit of Russian nationalism. So you hear time and time again Russian tune coming up. Scriabin was Rachmaninoff's classmate. Scriabin is an interesting character. He considered himself the messiah of a cult called the Theosophy. He declared that I'm God. I am more than aware of the truth of the universe, and my music is just so prophetic and powerful that it could end the world. And the last piece that he was writing before he suddenly died from an infection from shaving was a piece called Mysterium, which if completed, if he could ever complete it, would take 7 days and nights to perform. and it will be performed at the foothills of the Himalayas, surrounded by intellectuals, dancers, musicians, poets, in a cathedral made of incense and not of walls. What I'm trying to say is that he was insane. He was a lunatic. And he claimed that he saw colors in sound. It's called synesthesia. And some people are synesthetic. It's not to say that this doesn't happen, but he lied about it so that he could add to the prophetic nature of his deception. And his music takes on an interesting concoction of Russian folk, along with the modern language of Debussy, and of this mysticism that was over the top, which is very much that of the late Romantic spirit. So, one piece that I could play for you to give you an idea of Scriabin's music is that called Desire. (1908). And this is not even the craziest stuff. This is considered middle period. Now, you might say, what was that? And how is that relating to the stuff that we just heard? Well, there's certainly the element of exoticism, right? With all this strange exotic scales. There's the sort of a feeling of choir versus main voice. So it's subtle, but it's definitely part of it. And his late sonatas for piano, which are really absolutely great works, are very difficult to understand. They were used as a practice pieces for his magnum opus, which he could not finish, again, because of his shaving accident. And but this was very influential, and you will see how Scriabin's language influences the Russians following. In fact, I believe Rimsky-Korsakov said in 1909, as the students were preparing for the final exam, the composition students were preparing for final exam at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, Rimsky-Korsakov was known to have complained, everybody has turned into the disciples of Scriabin. All they were doing is of futility. I think that's what sort of paraphrase version that he said. So, any questions? Yes.
So the excerpt that you just played by Scriabin, would that be atonal music?
That's a great question. I wouldn't consider that it's atonal, because the notion of atonal is that it has no desire to go to somewhere, right? it means that the leading tone does not want to go somewhere. But you can hear in this version that it constantly wants to go, but it's not allowed to go. And you could argue that this is related to that of the Wagner excerpt that I played in the last class with the Tristan und Isolde, where the dominant does not resolve. There's a sense of resolution to that. Right? Tension, kind of released, but not really. Kind of released. Yeah. By this point in 1908, the playing of not resolving things and keeping things in this tense place was such a common thing that that's what propels a 20th century composer saying, let's not even think about resolving. Why don't we just treat every single note equally as a unit of energy? It can go anywhere. Not attracted, not inferior to the other. I should also mention that for one reason or the other, Russian pianism becomes incredibly advanced by 1870s and 1880s. I think it must be the works of certain very overzealous pianists who then taught. For example, teacher of Rachmaninoff and Scriabin were men named Zverev, who was not known to play any concerts himself, but was a tyrant of a teacher. He required that his students live in his house and put them through a grueling regimen of getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning and making them practice and beating them if they're not doing the right job, and then making them go to concerts every night, and then sometimes they'll be coming back at midnight only to start it all over again at 6 o'clock. But what this created was the level of virtuosity like no other. The composers themselves played ridiculously well. I mean, Rachmaninoff, I could argue, is one of the greatest pianists that ever lived. So, with that, maybe I'd like to play a little bit of the excerpt from Rachmaninoff's third concerto, third movement, which was for the longest time known as the Impossible Piece. This is played by Arkady Volodas. Let's try and... Oh, it's not connected. No, I talked for too long. Bells. Sort of a trip-up. Traditional dance. Entering the transition to the second theme of the movement. You can see that the structure is very clear now, very well educated, not like the five. But the spirit spirit of the nationalism lives in this very highly refined technique, both in ability and in writing. Second theme. The piece goes into a second section, the middle point, which you could argue is the development. But he has a brilliant idea, which is to do theme and variations separately within that. Theme. Bells. It's a pretty complicated theme, and he's going to develop it. So you can see how much more we added. First variation. You hear the glimpses of Tchaikovsky in there? Yes. Variation 2. Very modern chords, which jazz I think definitely stole a lot from. Next variation. Little snippet from the first movement, which is a very brilliant technique to connect the entire set together. So it's sort of like a fantasy into a different world. build up to return to the variation material. Crazy things going on. Exotic scale throughout. Last statement, piano alone. Another thing jazz stole, probably. Now the return to the very beginning stuff. Return of A. Episodic connection. Second material of the A section. Transition to second theme. It's a sonata form, but just a really big sonata. Second theme. Connection into coda condition, the hardest part of the movement. Bell movement. Last one. And that was live. So with that, I'd like to conclude today's lecture. Thank you for joining in. We have one more lecture left for 20th century, so please join the class. Thank you.